Loving God, grant us your peace and passion to proclaim your word in this world, that we may risk big for something good. Amen. Please be seated. Get cozy. Is that any better? Great. Yeah, let me know if it twists, has a mind of its own. I wonder, are we able to risk big for God? Are we able to risk big for something good, for the gospel, even in these challenging times? I want to share with you, I read an article this past week from the Gathering of Leaders, written by Haley Bankey. And there's one part that I'm just going to specifically read because it's about a mathematical concept, and I am not savvy on those words. So Haley talks about how the church right now is at a critical point, the mathematical concept of a critical point, that we are in this liminal limbo stage where our future is undefined. She says that, by definition, a critical point is a mathematical concept that expresses the church's reality so much better than an inflection point. In math, a critical point of a continuous function is a point at which the derivative is zero or undefined. The ache that we feel as a church is that we are undefined in this time. We are in limbo. We are in a liminal space. We are all seeking an answer, but by definition, at a critical point is yet undefined. There is not an answer in this moment. There's a beautiful graph that she shows where you can almost imagine the trajectory and the life of the church continuing to exist and continuing to move forward. And then we get to that critical point, to that horizontal axis where our trajectory enters that undefined or zero moment in time where we have a decision to make. We can then decide to move forward and unveil our undiscovered future as a new way of birthing the church, or we can fall into self-sabotage and self-reinforced failure. And the choice is ours, and we continually, throughout this pandemic, this liminal season, again and again find ourselves at that critical point where we have a decision to make. Now, I see this tying into our gospel passage, a very challenging parable that we have set before us. But it's the moment when the master entrusts the servants with his fortune, and he leaves. And then the servants each are at that critical moment, that critical point where they can decide, am I going to risk big for something good? Assuming if you think it's good. Am I going to try to chart forward into this undiscovered future and see what I can come up with, all that's been given to me? Or am I going to fall into this self-sabotaging behavior where fear overcomes and this self-reinforced failure is just perpetuated? Now, there are many ways to unearth this parable, right? The traditional one is more or less what I just said, where the master is seen as God, the master is seen to some as good, that the servants are seen as us, that the talents, although historically they are known to be about 20 years' worth of wages, that's a lot of money, folks. That's a lot of responsibility. But we pare it down, we water it down to a talent, a gift, something that we have or we can do. And so we see the two servants who take their talents and they double their money, they make that profit. We see them as good. They get that faithful line that we all want, right? Well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter into joy, right? Become my partner, depending upon which translation you read. And then we see the last slave or servant as the lazy, the wicked. Oh man, I don't want to be that guy, right? Shucks. Thrown out into outer darkness, seized with fear, buries the talent, does nothing with what God has given. And that is the traditional view. And that fits very nicely for Stewardship Sunday. That's awesome. However, there are also several other newer perspectives that have come out that challenge these very traditional ways of seeing the parable. Why do we assume that the master is God? Should we assume that the master is good? Or perhaps the master isn't? Why are the two that go out and they double the money, why are they the best? Perhaps it's that the one who saved the money, who didn't gain a profit, so to speak, was actually the heroic one. Perhaps they were even God in the scenario. Some have said that. If the last servant was the heroic one, maybe they were heroic because they were standing up and rebelling against and resisting the economic and the cultural unjust society. They were saying, no, I'm not going to fall into this temptation of how can I get more and make more for my master who has enslaved me. Instead, I'm going to resist that. I'm not going to give you an extra penny. I will guard what you gave me because it is not mine. It is not mine to give. It is not mine to risk. But I reject this materialistic or this economic unjust, and I don't want to participate in that. It is an intriguing new perspective on this parable. And there are a few other loose ones that I've heard along the way. And so I've been wrestling with that this past week or more, wondering, what's the point? What's the takeaway? Where's God in it all? And where I landed was, no matter which perspective you view this passage, this parable, I always leave with risk big for something good. Risk big for the gospel. Risk big for God. Whether it's taking what God has given you and sharing it and multiplying it and putting it out in the world for the good of others and spreading that love, or whether it's rebelling and standing up against the unjust culture that we live in. They're both big risks. And it's both for the goodness of God. And so I wonder, how can we do that? How can we risk big? Well, that's where I'm drawn to Paul's language in the letter to Ephesians, where his prayer, really, it's a prayer, that section. He says, "May Christ dwell in you as you are being rooted and grounded in love." It's because of love that we have the courage to risk. It's because of doing what love requires. I don't know if you can see this in the shot. I'm pointing to the sign. Doing what love requires, our stewardship theme, that we have the courage to risk because Christ dwells within each of us. I hope you know that. I hope you believe that Christ is with you, even in this moment. The love of God dwells within you and calls you, invites you to risk big for something good. And this love that I'm talking about is more than just a kindness. It's courageous action. It's how can we put ourselves out there to serve, to stand up against injustices, to walk humbly in faith with our God and our community, to seek mercy, to do justice and kindness in an ultimate way. Our stewardship theme is doing what love requires, and today is Ingathering Sunday. I wonder, are we really able to risk big for something good? Are we able to do what love requires? And when I talk about risk, I know many are getting ready for travel, for Thanksgiving and holidays, and we're measuring the risk of catching COVID if we travel or if we don't travel. And that's not the risk I'm talking about. I'm not talking about risking the safety of yourself or others, right? We need to be smart and do the courageous thing on that respect. Yeah, to do what love requires. But I'm talking about if we look at that critical point, can we be courageous to embrace a new way of being community? Embrace new and creative understandings of how to reach out and be love in this world. To not sink back in fear and self-sabotage and spiritual isolation, right? We don't have to be physically present to be a faith community. We know this. But we do have to be engaged. We do have to be connected. We do have to be willing to serve and to speak up, to risk big for love. So the question, the invitation stands before all of us this week. Will we risk big for something good by doing what love requires? Will you risk big for God? Amen.